Hi there. In this video lecture, we briefly discuss the question, what is Cold War? The Cold War was a historical epoch in international relations, commencing shortly after the conclusion of the Second World War and terminating in the early 1990s. It was characterized by the overarching dynamics between the United States and the Soviet Union. Despite the Cold War rapidly receding into history, various interpretations of its nature persist in influencing expectations regarding key aspects of contemporary international relations. Individuals who anticipate a future devoid of significant ideological strife to be fundamentally harmonious often perceive the Cold War era as intrinsically adversarial. Three principal perspectives exist on the Cold War. Each produces a series of distinct assertions regarding its origins, characteristics, objectives, and impact on contemporary international relations. The prevailing perspective is that the Cold War constituted a fierce contest for dominance between the superpowers. War denotes tension, armed conflict, and a zero-sum dynamic among superpowers. The term cold denotes the existence of elements that purportedly inhibited confrontation and averted a hot war. Traditional historiography relies on a characterization of the Cold War that presupposes significant East-West friction with the potential for escalation to nuclear conflict. Undoubtedly, there is considerable contention among proponents of this perspective on the attribution of culpability for the Cold War. A prevalent divide exists between orthodox and revisionist historians. The conventional perspective posits that the Cold War represented a fight between opposing universal values. In the West, the principles of a market economy and a multi-party democracy were esteemed. In the East, single-party governance and a centrally planned economy were greatly esteemed. The evident clash of ideologies and the stubborn disposition of its proponents were the primary catalysts of the conflict. The actions of the Soviet Union during and after the Second World War were a significant catalyst for the Cold War within this extensive ideological framework. The United States' containment strategies were defensive responses to a fundamentally aggressive and expansionist adversary. Without nuclear weapons and the principle of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, the Cold War could have escalated into active conflict on several occasions. Regrettably, the Soviet Union could not maintain its rivalry with the United States, and this incapacity was the primary cause of the disintegration of the Cold War framework. The timing of that collapse was significantly influenced by the readiness of the United States and its allies to counter or surpass Soviet escalations in the armaments race. With the conclusion of the Cold War, the United States exerts dominance over the international system. Given the benign character of American hegemony, such supremacy is not a significant worry. Revisionists concur with orthodox scholars regarding the essence of the Cold War, but invert the attribution of culpability. Revisionism gained prominence in the 1960s amid the Vietnam War. However, it continues to be a peripheral ideology in the United States. Revisionists underscore the influence of the United States during and subsequent to 1945. For instance, while the United States suffered 400,000 fatalities during World War II, the USSR endured 27 million fatalities. The American economy prospered due to the conflict, whereas the Soviet economy was nearly obliterated. Revisionists argue that Soviet actions were primarily defensive, aimed at establishing a genuine security zone in Eastern Europe, whereas the United States sought to reorganize the international economic system to serve its national interests. The Cold War was a time characterized by American supremacy, justified by an illusory Soviet threat. The intrinsic economic deficiencies of the Soviet Union were pivotal in understanding its dissolution in 1991. The conclusion of the Cold War could have transpired significantly earlier and without the exorbitant costs associated with the arms race. The post-Cold War period was perilous as the United States had no military adversary or political opposition to its conception of the optimal world order. Contrary to the perspective that the Cold War was fundamentally adversarial, irrespective of the primary instigator, an alternative viewpoint posits that the Cold War was, in hindsight, beneficial to both parties. For the United States, it addressed the issue of how to manage Germany and Japan, both of whom were pivotal nations in instigating the Second World War. The Cold War provided the Soviet Union and the United States with a de facto resolution to the German issue by solidifying the social and political boundaries of Europe, both Eastern and Western. The continuation of the Cold War facilitated the preservation of a rigid nuclear hierarchy among superpowers and their allies, as well as between nuclear and non-nuclear states. The theoretical prospect of nuclear conflict relegated practical disputes within the opposing blocs to the priorities of global stability maintained by the superpowers. Ultimately, formidable domestic interests on both sides perpetuated the Cold War. In the United States, the arms race bolstered segments of the military-industrial complex, legitimized foreign involvement, enabled the formation of the national security state, and enhanced the authority of the presidency relative to other branches of the federal government. Beyond the Iron Curtain, the Cold War legitimized internal repression, subjugated civilians to military sectors, and upheld an authoritarian governmental system based on the exigencies of geopolitical catch-up. While there is validity in the principal assertions of these schools of thought, they together exhibit a propensity to overstate the level of coherence and foresight in the formulation and execution of foreign policy. The Cold War was an era characterized by both authentic fighting and collaboration among the superpowers. It emerged from an extended period of geopolitical instability in Europe, where internal strife ultimately subjugated the continent to two external superpowers, with markedly divergent social systems and minimal diplomatic engagement with one another. Conflict between them was unavoidable and intensified by their mutual suspicion of one another. It is important to note that the Cold War era coincided with the advent of the nuclear age and decolonization, both of which heightened the stakes in the rivalry. Nevertheless, despite the myriad causes that separated the superpowers, they possessed significant common interests that tempered their rivalry, especially following the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when the specter of nuclear war loomed large. The partition of Europe, armaments control, and mutual interest in preventing real wars in the Third World from escalating into direct combat contributed to a certain level of moderation during the Cold War. Nevertheless, as evidenced during the détente period in the late 1960s, it proved exceedingly challenging for the superpowers to formally recognize their mutual interests in a manner that would conclusively terminate the confrontation. To the extent that the Cold War constituted a conflict, it is evident that the former Soviet Union and communism were the defeated parties. Conversely, in a time when global order challenges surpass any state's ability to address them effectively, and considering the evidence indicating that the Cold War dynamic was primarily an adversarial partnership, it is crucial not to overstate the achievements of the United States and its allies.